All right, so last week we started talking about the men that influenced Erasmus and his humanism. And so we're going to do a quick review because we're going to need to remember some of these names and some of the things that they did because they are going to influence Erasmus. Um, and as just a point of reference, again, just a reminder that the Byzantine Empire has fallen at this point. The Ottomans have taken it over. The Turks are there. They're killing Greek or Eastern Orthodox Christians, and those Christians are fleeing west towards the Holy Roman Empire, as it's called. And this is going to, we already saw the foundations through Wycliffe and primarily through Wycliffe in this class. Although if you were listening to other histories of Christianity, you would see it even before Wycliffe. But you saw the groundwork for the Reformation was coming through Wycliffe. Again, it predates Wycliffe, but for the purposes of translation, English translations, Wycliffe is where we picked up the story. And he sets the groundwork for the Reformation about 100 years before the Reformation occurs. He influences men like Jan Hus and so on and so forth. But at the same time, Wycliffe is working on a reformation of the church. We have another proto-reformer called Francesco Petrarch, and he is considered the father of humanism. He is contemporary with Wycliffe, and he starts off his life in a very poor way, a very shameful way, as we talked about. He had many mistresses. He became a Roman Church priest without any desire to be spiritual. It just was the thing that he did. And he had many mistresses while he was a Roman Church priest. He had several illegitimate children. He lived a life of debauchery, and then he repented. And when he repents, you read his works and his quotes, you tell there's a great remorse for the way he had lived his life. And that now Christ has replaced his desires. Christ has replaced the way he was living, that it's his central focus, and he wants to live a spiritually moral life. He wants to model himself after Christ. As such, he becomes concerned about the corruption within the Roman Church. Well, because I guarantee he wasn't living this lifestyle by himself. And so if it was completely unacceptable in the Roman Church to live this way as a Roman priest, he wouldn't have lasted very long as a Roman priest. And what he's seeing is that it is acceptable to live this way, and it shouldn't be. And so he begins to have concerns for the Roman Church. And one of the ways that he wants to reform the church is to go back to the sources. And this is what it means to be a humanist. Okay, a humanist is going to focus their attention on the classical works of early Christianity for church fathers and things of that nature, but also secular works, rich secular works that aren't necessarily Christian, aren't necessarily Jewish, but are still good works. And what they might be good in the sense that they're just beautiful, they're artistic. They might be good in the sense that they teach good truths, they're philosophical, but they're not necessarily grounded in Christianity, but they still teach good things. And so to go back to the sources means to go back to these fountains of wisdom, as they would call it. That's what it means to ad fontes, to go back to the sources. So he goes, there's a love for the classical authors. And in order to do this, we are so fortunate that I can mention any name and nearly any book in here, and you are a click away from having access to it. You're a click away. Well, for these guys, that's not the case. If you want to go back to the classics, you got to go find them. And so the way he does that is he travels around to Roman Church monasteries looking for these works and gathering them, collecting them, taking what he's allowed to take, borrowing what he's allowed to borrow, reproducing what he can. There's no printing press yet, so he's got to do it all by hand. So he goes traveling different monasteries looking for manuscripts. He discovers works of Cicero. I think I mentioned last week, Dan, Dan fact checked me, thankfully. Harlan, I said something to the effect of, because I couldn't remember when Cicero was dated. I said, I think second century or something like that. And I was mostly wrong. It is second century. It's just second century BC, not AD. So that's when he was born, but he's primarily first century BC. So Cicero was one of these Roman church authors that was highly beloved by, he would be the equivalent, my best estimation, to give you like an equivalence. He would be the equivalent to like what we would think of Shakespeare today. Just this high art, beautiful work, the pinnacle of writing and things of that nature. That's Cicero for the early church, or well, I should say early church time period. Cicero is seen as this amazing author, such that I mentioned last week, Jerome himself loves Cicero. Jerome saw himself, he had a dream, a vision, if you will, a dream in which he's accused of loving Cicero more than he loves the Bible. And Jerome is convicted by this dream, and he puts Cicero aside and makes the Bible his sole focus. But that's just to give you an idea of the impact Cicero has. And so Cicero, his name comes up over and over and over again as to influential works from influential works on different people. So he also seeks to restore Livy's history. Livy is another one, that he's a Roman historian, contemporary with Jesus. And people love his works. He tells history in such a way that it's compelling, and you want to read what's next. And so people love Livy's works. And as he goes around finding manuscripts, he's finding Livy's history in multiple places, and he's collecting the works, and he's noticing that they aren't identical. And so he does the work to restore what he believes is what Livy wrote. He does textual criticism. What is textual criticism? I've mentioned it. I should probably define it for you. Textual criticism is when you take multiple manuscripts of the same work that read differently, and you have a process by which you try to determine what the author actually wrote. When did a scribe make a mistake? Find that mistake and correct it, and then you produce a critical work. That critical work is is the result of your research, right? So I went through, I looked at all the manuscripts, I saw all of the variants, and I picked variants based on a methodology. We'll talk about methodology later, but we picked variants based on methodology, and then we create a critical work. That critical work is the result of your research, and that's what he did. So he sought to restore Livy's history. He saw multiple manuscripts, and he in his best attempt, attempted to bring it back to what Livy would have written initially. And then he's also the one who coins for us the term Dark Ages. Again, he sees the church having fallen into a dark period, morally, spiritually, because they have ignored the classics, and so he wants to bring them back to the classics. The next guy is Lorenzo Valla. Of the three men I spoke of, this is the most influential man on Erasmus by far. He becomes an expert in Latin. Oh boy, does this man love Latin. He loves Latin more than I love English. And he's writing all sorts of stuff on the Latin language, like, I don't want to say dictionaries, but kind of like style guides, which would include dictionary, how to use certain words. He uses textual criticism to challenge the authorship of the Apostles' Creed. So we talked about that. We have the Apostles' Creed today. We love the Apostles' Creed. It's a good work, but he is the one who says the name of it is wrong. We call it the Apostles' Creed. We've never called it anything but that, but it wasn't written by the apostles. And that was the claim in his days, that the apostles wrote the Apostles' Creed. And he challenged that. And he was able to demonstrate that the apostles did not, in fact, write the Apostles' Creed. And we also agree with him. The apostles did not write the Apostles' Creed, but it's still a good work. It's back to that good and useful, but not scripture. Okay. Then we have his textual criticism he used to challenge the authenticity of Constantine's donation. Now, this one was highly impactful. the Pope had been using the document that we call the Constantine's donation to establish secular ruling over what we call the Holy Roman Empire of this time. Basically, Constantine was an emperor. He conquered an area, and before he died, this is the claim, he wrote a donation to the Pope, giving all of the area that he had conquered to the Pope. The Pope had been using this document as grounds to say, I own this. I own this. Remember when we were talking about Wycliffe, the Pope had said about the King of England that he was just renting England and that he was 70 years behind on rent. And so that was the battle over England there. And so, so he challenged Constantine's donation, and he determines that it's a forgery. He doesn't necessarily point out that it's the Roman Church that forged it themselves, but that's the end result if you read his works, that there's only so many conclusions. And so he calls for the Roman Church to give up all secular power and to return the lands to their rulers and to not to own this property. And remember, Wycliffe himself had problems with the church owning property. He didn't think they should own anything. So this is right after Wycliffe. Wycliffe had just passed away only about a decade before this. Well, I should say a decade before Vala is born. And so then he has he creates a work called the Annotations of the Greek New Testament. And what he does here, as he's traveling around picking up manuscripts, he's also picking up Greek manuscripts. Because remember, the Byzantine Empire has fallen and they're traveling left. So they're bringing with them, what are they bringing with them? Their Greek Bibles, their Greek Septuagints, and their Greek New Testaments. They're coming over from the east to the west. The west has been using the Latin Vulgate for 1,000 years at this point. They're using the Latin Vulgate. So, but in the east, they spoke Greek, so they didn't use the Latin. They used the Greeks. And so now we have the Greek New Testament coming into the west. And you have Greek-speaking people who can teach the Greek language to the people in the west. So he starts making notes of all the differences that are between the Greek New Testament that is provided by the Byzantine Empire and the Latin Vulgate in the Western Empire. And he never publishes this work. It never gets published. It gets stuck away in a monastery, and it won't be found until we get to Erasmus. Erasmus is the one who's going to find this work. And then lastly, he's considered a champion for reason and truth. And he is the reason why there were some popes that actually listened to him. And they did make small changes. But one of the things that they did is they started to support the humanist cause. They began to fund it. They gave them the funds to go around and collect manuscripts and things of that nature. And Pope Nicholas, is it the fourth? The fifth. Pope Nicholas V sets aside a reading room in the Vatican to collect these manuscripts. And this is done in 1453, sets aside this reading room. And so this reading room would begin to collect manuscripts, and this reading room would collect all sorts of manuscripts, not just Greek New Testaments, but all sorts of things. That reading room will become what we call today the Vatican Library. And it's going to be one of the greatest libraries in history, just like we had with the House of Wisdom, and we had with the, I can't think of his name, the Greek king, Ptolemy, the Greek king Ptolemy, who had the library in Egypt, the library in Alexandria. So libraries are always the source of power and wisdom, and the Vatican is going to create the Vatican Library, but it's going to start because of Lorenzo Valla. Lorenzo Valla has a place to store these manuscripts. This is also that time period where this reading room comes into place, and we have manuscripts being collected and put in this reading room. As a reading room, the manuscripts that are going in are not collated. They're not documented. They're just kind of there. When the Vatican Library becomes officially the Vatican Library in 1475, about 2 decades later, that's when things get collated. And one of the first documents we have in there, or one of the documents that gets collated in there, is what we call Codex Vaticanus. Codex Vaticanus is believed to have come over from the Byzantine Empire, found its way into the reading room, and then it was the first record we have of it as a documented existence is in 1475, when everything in the Vatican library gets documented with a way to find it, like a library card index and things of that nature. So that's how Codex Vaticanus ends up there. So that's really cool, and that's really important because Codex Vaticanus is going to come up multiple times in our lessons. So then lastly, we had Rudolf Agricola. He is another humanist, but he's local to Erasmus himself, and he's educated by the Brethren of Common Life. We'll remember that Erasmus himself was educated by the same school. He becomes a professor of a nearby university. He taught the humanist philosophy. He promoted learning of Latin and Greek, and that's right, on the invention of the dialectic. This is where he critiques the current education system of his day. He says that what they're teaching their students is primarily rote memorization, and he believes they should be critical thinkers. They should be able to think through issues, not just rehearse lines of information. And one of the things that he does that's also fascinating is he is able to teach a deaf person how to communicate both orally and on paper. And in his day and age, they did not think deaf people could think critically, that it was impossible for them to. They would have seen him as having mental challenges. And so he changes the view of deaf people for his day, at least in his culture. And I just think of people, like I said last week, Cherith Hunt, whose ministry is to the deaf people. That ministry may not even exist today if it weren't for people like Rudolf Agricola, who changed the perspective of the culture on deaf people. Let's see. There we go. And so we picked up with Erasmus after that. So about 9 years after Valla dies, Erasmus of Rotterdam is born, and 4 years later, Agricola will release his work on the dialectica there, which is going to impact that world quite largely. So Erasmus, when he was 10, he was taken to Deventer. There he learned under the school of the Brethren of the Common Life. He is also born the illegitimate son of a Roman Church priest. Again, just like Petrarch, who had several mistresses and illegitimate sons. Well, Erasmus was an illegitimate son of a Roman Church priest, and his mom was forbidden to marry him because he was a Roman Church priest. Later, he takes on the name Desiderius, so he becomes Desiderius Erasmus, which is the Latin word for desired. And he studied at Deventer under the School of Brethren of Common Life. This is where he's going to get introduced to classical works, and he's going to fall in love with them, and he's going to find himself becoming a humanist. So he embraces secular education. He was not interested in religious education. He found it to be dead. Precepts and rules and things of that nature. He did not see religious education necessarily as exciting, though that will change for him. So he embraces secular education. He loves Cicero. He loves all of those early Greek classics. This is what motivates him. He's left orphaned at 16 because his parents die of the bubonic plague, and he joins an Augustinian monastery. So in this Augustinian monastery, the classics are not really, they are frowned upon. So he's not really allowed to read them during the day. So he reads them instead at night. But during the day, he does fall in love with two particular men, Jerome and Augustine. Since this is an Augustinian monastery, you're going to learn a lot about Augustine. And he falls in love with them, but particularly Jerome in general. He loves Jerome so much that he begins to copy Jerome's works by hand so he could have his own personal copy of them. And so at night, though, he continued to study the Greek classics, the Greek and Roman classics. And so Cicero would be one of them. He studied Valla's works on Latin. Remember, Valla was an expert on Latin, and he's considered second only to Jerome on his expertise on Latin. and he's highly regarded. However, Vala at this time has created a lot of waves because of his work on Constantine's donation and things of that nature. So Vala is frowned upon heavily. His works are suppressed but not banned. The banning of Vala's works is going to come later, as is the banning of Erasmus's works. So he studies Vala's works on Latin, and he finds himself becoming an expert in Latin. He's sitting at the feet of these expert men. His two favorite people are Vala and Jerome. Is Vala from a humanist standpoint and Jerome from a classical standpoint. He is becoming an expert in Latin. And so that's a big deal. He writes a work in 1490 against barbarisms. This is against people who do not believe, this is a polemic, who do not believe that secular education is necessary, that the Bible is all you need. And so he writes this work against that. And so this is a big deal for him. And this work, while it is his first work, does not get published for a long time, not till the 1520. 1520 is when it gets publicized, but he writes it in 1490 because it's against the Roman Church's views that secular education is not needed. Again, remember, he doesn't see the Bible as alive. It's a necessary work, it's a divine work, but boy, is it a drudgery in his view. What's exciting for him are other works. He's ordained as a Roman Church priest in 1492, and he joins a monastery. And the very next year, he leaves. He hates the monastery. He hates what it stands for. He doesn't like anything to do with it. And he is able to give up his monastic vows. The Pope gives him relief to do that, and then he starts traveling and doing his own scholarship. He studies at the University of Paris. And it would have taken him 15 years to complete his theology degree, but they taught a scholastic approach. And I didn't get a lot into what the scholastic approach was last week, and we still probably won't talk about it much, but it is at odds with humanism. But if you want to know what like a scholastic approach might be, if you want to read some people, Aquinas, Anselm, I had another guy in my mind I can't think of, but Aquinas and Anselm are usually propped up as people of scholasticism, which he rejected. He didn't like the scholastic approach to theology. I love Aquinas and Anselm, but I also love Erasmus, so I see benefits in both. And so he wanted to learn under humanists, and he wanted to learn more humanist ways of studying the Bible. And so one of his students asked him to go back to England with him. This particular student was well connected with important people, prominent humanists that were there, and Thomas Linacre being one of them. Thomas Linacre saw that Erasmus had a gift for languages in particular, and he says, you need to learn Greek. You need to go to Italy, and you need to sit under a Greek teacher and learn Greek. Now, Italy is where some of those people from the Byzantine Empire had found themselves, and now they're in colleges teaching Greek as native-speaking Greek people. So, right? So now they've learned Latin, and now they're teaching Greek to Latin-speaking people. Because remember, Latin is not the language of the common person. Latin is the language of the educated person. You only spoke Latin if you went to school. Okay? Otherwise, you were speaking the dialects of the maps that we had shown before, whether it be English, Spanish, French, German, things of that nature. That's what you were speaking. But if you were educated, you wrote in Latin. I shouldn't say necessarily spoke, because it wasn't a conversational language. It was a writing language. So people weren't necessarily just talking in Latin. Some did. Some did. Some were so involved in Latin that they taught it. But again, you're talking about the same kind of people who speak Latin today, that they're highly educated and that they spend a lot of time in. And so Erasmus, this was just to reconfirm the Byzantine Empire, just as a reminder, it's down, and so they're here. And so this is where you're going to find the Greek-speaking people migrating to and teaching Greek. Okay. While he's here, While he's doing his travels, he's going to meet an 8-year-old named Henry. Henry is going to be second in line to the throne. He is Henry VIII eventually. Here, he'll also meet Thomas More, who's going to be one of his best friends. He is, over the next 2 decades, he's going to study Greek. He's going to learn it very well. He gets an honorary degree from a Greek school in Italy. And as he is traveling, he does the same thing as the humanists before him. He's collecting works. And so classical Greek literature and classical Roman literature. So Erasmus, like Valla, like Petrarch, like Wycliffe, he's going to see that the Roman Church has many issues and needs reform. Erasmus's thought process is to use humanism as a tool to reform the church. And I actually skipped this part, and I shouldn't have in my review. While studying under the humanists, and he's studying under them, he hears preaching from the book of Acts. And this preacher, for the first time, he's teaching through Acts as history. And so he's seeing cultural aspects, he's seeing the life of people, and he's seeing the language and the context, and preaching is being drawn from scripture. And this is brand new to him. He's not heard stuff like this before. Prior to this, if he had heard preaching from the book of Acts or elsewhere, it would have been looking for precepts, and it would have been looking for rules and things of that nature. And they would have been debating over hidden things that would point to Christ. Now, I'm not against that sort of thing, but first you teach the context of what you're teaching. And then if one of those things is there, you be careful about how you teach that. But this was the style of the day, and he just found no connection to it. He felt like this was dead preaching. And I think he was probably largely right. So while sitting under a humanist, he hears the Bible being taught as not just rules and precepts and pedantics, because that's how he referred to it, but as alive. He heard the Bible as alive. And this is where he realizes he needs to give over special attention, his primary attention, to the Bible. He's not going to give up the classic works, but this is where the Bible will become his primary focus. And he's going to want to make that his central focus. And this is where he says, when I get a little money, I buy books. And if any is left, I buy food and clothes. And this is the heart of Erasmus, that education is what's important to him. He's super prioritizing education over even the necessities of life. He took tutors when he could afford them, and he immersed himself in the Greek language, and he became a Greek scholar as well as a Latin scholar. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the works that he did that led him up to, one, as an advocate of the Reformation while never leaving the Roman Church. He will always be a part of the Roman Church up to the day he dies, just like Wycliffe was, just like Valla was, just like Petrarch was. But he's definitely going to influence the Reformation. And he's going to have arguments with the reformers themselves, but he's going to find himself a man without a home. The reformers don't want him, and the Roman Church doesn't want him. And but he's in favor of the reformers' doctrines, many of their doctrines, but not the way they are going about reforming the church. He wants to reform the church from the inside. They are finding themselves being removed from the church, so they're doing it from the outside. And so this creates contention. And Erasmus is a man without any real home, but he never actually leaves the Roman Church, nor is he ever excommunicated. So he dies in the Roman Church. So the complete works of Erasmus are available to us in English today. It was published in 2016. It is 86 volumes. 86 volumes. The man wrote prolifically, and this is just I haven't bought this set yet. I would love to. Problem is, I want it in a digital copy so I can search it, because 86 volumes, I'm never going to read through all of that. But I would love to be able to do a search function. So I'm hoping my software will eventually pick this up and this will be an option. But for now, you can still buy digital versions on Kindle and things of that nature. But 86 volumes of his works. He wrote a lot. We're not going to talk about all 86. We're going to talk about a few. So one of his works is called the Colloquies. Little anecdotes about the proper ways to communicate, but ended up being a bunch of short stories about random things. It's just an interesting work, but he was really focused on how to properly communicate to people in the written form. He translated many classics into Latin, or not into Latin, into various languages. He translated many classical works into various languages. Interestingly enough, one of John Calvin's first works is a commentary on Seneca's De Clementia. And Seneca wrote to Nero. I'm not going to get into all the works of that, but John Calvin writes a commentary on this work. The work that his source material is Erasmus's translation. So Erasmus translates it, and John Calvin takes the translation and writes a commentary. So I just thought that was really cool. And that was in 1529 that he does that. Then we have adages in his first edition. Adages is really cool. I really like adages. Well, adage, it's such a simple work. Anyone can pick this up and read it. It's wonderfully done. But all adages is Erasmus, in collecting all of these different Latin and Greek manuscripts, he begins to record idioms. That's all it is. It is a book of collected idioms. And what's fascinating about it is how many of them we're still using today. So we'll read a few of them. I got 2 pages of them. We'll read a few. More haste, less speed. This is where eventually we beget haste makes waste, things of that nature. So more haste, less speed is the idea is the faster you try to go, the longer it's going to take you, right? Because you're rushing through it and you're making mistakes. So that's that one. A rolling stone gathers no moss. Necessity is the mother of invention. One step at a time. To be in the same boat. To walk on tiptoe. To kill 2 birds with 1 stone. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Now, what's interesting about this one is this one's attributed to Erasmus himself. So he didn't just record this one, he wrote this one. So I thought that was a pretty good one. No sooner said than done, a necessary evil, to leave no stone unturned. God helps those that help themselves. And a couple more. Breaking the ice, teaching an old dog new tricks. War is sweet for those who have not tried it. We'll circle back to that one, but Erasmus was very much a pacifist. To exact tribute from the dead, or to tax the dead. Wine speaks the truth. The cart before the horse. Time reveals all things. Pandora's box. Well begun is half done. To call a spade, know thyself, and thumbs up, and other more vulgar hand gestures are also included in his adages. But the thumbs up. So a lot of that, we still use almost all of these today. These are very popular. We use them, but he repopularized them. They were not around until he did his adages. Adages was a very common work that was published. So anyway, that's a cool work. And it's not like deep and scholarly. Anyone can pick this up and read through it. It's a very easy read. He writes the Handbook of the Christian Knight. Erasmus, I mentioned, he's very much opposed to war. He's a pacifist. And so he writes a handbook for the Christian knight. He's against the concept of the Crusades, things of that nature, which would be against the scholastics as well. So the very concept of a just war or a righteous war is foreign to Erasmus. He does not believe such a thing exists. Unlike someone like Thomas Aquinas, who does believe there's reasons for just war and things of that nature. So Erasmus, being very much a pacifist, says that the Christians should not engage in war for any reason. The only war that they shouldn't be engaged in is spiritual warfare, that they should be warring with their flesh, that they should be warring for sanctification and things of that nature. So very much spiritual warfare, not physical. And in this, he attacks some Roman church practices. He talks about how the Roman church venerates Mary, but he asks them, do you venerate her? Do you want to emulate her humility? So you prop her up, but do you prop up her humility as well? He says they want to please Peter and Paul, but do they emulate his faith? They said their faith. He says to emulate their faith would be better than 10 pilgrimages to Rome. He says you make much of Paul's body encased in glass, but do you admire Paul in his epistles? So that was, how Paul presents himself. He says, you honor the statues of wood and stone of Christ, but where is the fruit of the Spirit in your life? He says, do you have the image of Christ in your behavior? Things of that nature. So he's talking about Christian behavior. What's really interesting about this particular work, Handbook of the Christian Knight, is that we found a copy of this in 2015, so just about a decade ago. It was in English, which he didn't write it in English. He wrote it in Latin. It was in English in Alnwick Castle, and it was date stamped to 1523 by the translator, so we know when it was translated, and the translator is William Tyndale. So we found that in 2015. I thought that's super cool. So Tyndale translated Erasmus's work called the Handbook for the Christian Knight. He finds valas and notations, he updates them and publishes them in 1504. I'm going to move a little quicker. We'll pick it up on the review next week. But this is going to be massively influential. This is the first time Erasmus is suggesting that the Latin Vulgate needs to be updated in reflection to what they have for Greek manuscripts. And so he reproduces Vala's annotations. He finds them, he reproduces them, and he has them published. This is a big deal. However, not a lot of movement happens right away. In about a decade, we're going to see a lot of movement in this direction. In Praise of Folly, and Praise of Folly is his most published work. Even today, it's still the most published work. It is a satire. Folly is a woman, and she is the narrator of the book. And she just narrates how interesting life is because of her influence on the world. It starts off very satirical, very light. He's making a polemic, if you will. He's correcting European traditions, European superstitions, all sorts of stuff that he finds vain. But then I'll read it next week, but then he turns Folly's attention to the church, and he begins to correct monks and theologians and priests and their behaviors. And he does it through the voice of Folly, as if Folly's the one that's causing them to do these things. She's doing it. And this is, I think, personally, as I kind of work through some of this, I haven't read the whole work, but as I work through some of this, it seems to be Folly as a woman is in contrast to Romans 8, Lady Wisdom, or the wisdom personified in Proverbs 8 is personified as a woman. So I think Lady Folly or the woman Folly and the Proverbs 8, the woman of wisdom, are in contrast with each other. And I thought that was pretty cool. We'll read some of these quotes next week. But after that, we'll read those quotes, and then we will get into Erasmus's Greek New Testament. And we will talk about a couple other guys right before that. But we'll get into his Greek New Testament next week, and that will be the most impactful work on the Christian church for the next 400 years. So we'll be very impacted by what Erasmus does. And that is it for today. You all are dismissed. Thank you.